Evening all. Alexandra Dean first attracted major public and professional attention with Bombshell, the 2017 documentary she directed about Hedy Lamarr, that sultry black and white film beauty of the 1930s and 40s, who was also an electronics whiz. Her inventions advanced radio guidance for Allied torpedoes in World War II and led to modern cell phone and Bluetooth technology. But Dean herself didn't so much explode on the scene like a bombshell as steadily study and work her way up the media ladder. With degrees from Harvard, Oxford, and the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, she was a researcher for HBO, a field producer for Now on PBS, a print reporter for Bloomberg's Businessweek magazine, and a producer of hour-long specials for Bloomberg Television. In 2014, with actress Susan Sarandon, she co-founded Reframed Pictures to produce series and documentaries, most notably Bombshell, which had its world premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival. In 2018, with the Intellectual Property Corporation for YouTube Originals, she made This Is Paris, a documentary about famous for being famous Paris Hilton that's attracted over 18 million views and is rated by Google as one of the 2 most sticky shows on that platform, meaning viewers watch to the end. It also captured and I thought encouraged the hotel chain heiress's developing social conscience as she joined other alumni of an overly harsh residential treatment center come boarding school in Utah to get state regulations preventing future abuse in such places. More recently, Alexandra has worked as director, showrunner, co-producer, and executive producer of a scripted series on Lamarr for Apple TV, a 10-part series for A&E, so far untitled, but don't be surprised by rabbit ears. Dean also has 2 sons, a quote, charming Englishman husband, and long ties to our area, where I've played tennis with her mom and dad. Quote, I've been going to Sag Harbor since I was a kid because my grandma lived on Deering Lane, she says. We have a family place in Bridgehampton since she died. Hamptons is one of my favorite places on earth. So, Alexandra, over to you.
I think you probably know if you've seen Bombshell or Paris. You know, what I do, I'm trying to make films and series about people whose voices I think haven't been heard because they were a little too easy to overlook. And I'm really trying to challenge us as a society to look a little closer and look in unusual places for those people who have contributed something that I think is meaningful to our society. And I want to talk about that in this talk today, but I also, before I launch into it, I want to hear a little bit from you guys about why you're tuning in and what you're really interested in, so I can kind of tailor what I'm about to say to you. So, Barbara, you know, for instance, you, why are you tuning in tonight? What are you hoping to hear? Oh no, we can't hear you, Barbara. I forgot we have this audio problem. We can't hear you. All right, while you work on the audio, I'm going to ask you, Michael, because I can see you. Why are you tuning in tonight? What would you like to hear about?
I think you're muted.
You're definitely muted, Michael. There you are.
I'd like to hear more about what brought you to Hedy Lamarr.
Yeah, how did I find Hedy Lamarr? How did I find that story?
This
All right.
to be fascinating.
Fascinating. And you've seen Bombshell?
Yes.
Okay, I will definitely cover that. Thank you, Michael. What about you, Arlene? Is there anything specific that you wanted to hear about?
No, just because it sounded like it might be interesting.
All right. Are you interested in, you know, films and programming on women in general?
Films in general.
Films in general. That's big. Okay, great. That's a big canvas we can cover. Wonderful. And what about you guys? I can't see all your faces, but Diane and Elizabeth, Charles, Sasha, Ruth. Anybody else want to chime in with something you're interested in knowing about?
Hi there, this is Sasha. I am actually in Texas and I was a volunteer at DocFest where we showed your awesome film Bombshell.
Oh yeah,
yeah. And we just loved it and the house was packed and I would say that was the most successful film of the festival.
Oh.
I just thought it was awesome and I just happened to chance across the listing on the library website and I was so excited to see your name just to learn from you. I am a screenwriting grad student, and although I don't specialize in documentaries, I am very interested in just the craft and the process and thinking how you maybe think through ideas and create stories, or basically, you know, how you pick the stuff you picked, even for your documentaries. So thank you so much for having me.
It was a pleasure, Sasha. Thank you. So the craft and the storytelling, and how do you pick your subjects, you know, and how do you know what you're going to say, I guess, through those subjects. So that's a really great part of it that I'll definitely include.
Thank you. Thinking like the idea development also, like how you think through the beats, basically. Thank you so much.
How I think through the beats. Ruth, I feel like there was a ... from you for a second. Did you have something to say before I get started? No? All right. So how did I come up with Bombshell? I think that's a great place to start. Bombshell was something that came to me in a way when I was starting this production company with my brother and the actress Susan Sarandon, and we knew we wanted to tell stories that were reframing the conversation. That's why we called our company Reframed. But how do we do it? And how do we come up with something really surprising? And I personally wanted to do something about women. I was thinking a lot at that time about women in power, and you know, what is being powerful for us, and why does it feel like it's such a complicated path to power, and why does it feel complicated to keep power, to stay in power? You know, it's just an unusual topic for women. So I wanted to talk about that. And I think beauty plays into that in a really interesting way, right? Because for women, maybe more than men, traditionally, women have felt a great amount of power, some women at some part in their life, because of their beauty. And that can be a strange experience if you're talking about kind of graduating into power through your professional accomplishments. Maybe at some point in that trajectory, you've suddenly had a period of great power for your beauty or your looks that you did not achieve, nothing to do with you, you kind of pass through. And it can be very wild for women. And then you lose it when you don't deserve to lose it either. You suddenly become invisible, right? So the path to power, the path to respect, the path to professionalism for a woman is very different, I think, than for a man. And I wasn't seeing any films or anything that talked about that. And I really wanted to talk about it. So I was looking for stories like that. And I had been doing a series for 2 years on Bloomberg Television about today's inventors. And I loved all the inventors. I was madly in love with all of them. About half of them were male and about half of them were female. And they were from all different backgrounds. And only the white men were getting the money to make their inventions into something in the world. Only the white men got to see them happen. And that happened so much over the 2 years that it became crushingly obvious to me that anyone else wasn't going to get the funding. And some of the people that I was working for at Bloomberg started saying, stop covering people who don't seem like they're going to get their invention made. And I got angry because I felt like wonderful inventions were coming from everybody. And that's how the world is. You don't have to be a certain type of person to be inventive. That's ludicrous, right? We know that. And yet when it comes to opening our wallets, we were voting with our wallets. With our wallets, we were saying only a certain type of person is a real inventor. And that type of person looks a bit like Thomas Edison. If they didn't look like Thomas Edison, no chance. And so I had these two thoughts in my head. I want to talk about women and beauty and power, and I want to talk about inventors. And I was out in the world, you know, Sasha, to your question, how does that become Bombshell? I was out in the world telling people that, right? Some people would say, what do you want to make a doc on? And I would use a setting like this to tell people, that's what I want to do, put it out there in the world. I want to talk about these things, and I'm really interested in this problem about inventors. And someone came to me with the book Hedy's Folly that had been written by Richard Rhodes, in which he says Hedy Lamarr may have been the inventor of this really critical piece of what became frequency hopping and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and GPS. And I read the book and I felt that Richard Rhodes was saying, I think it was probably more George Antheil, her co-inventor, who was a musician and had that kind of mind, and Hedy was kind of along for the ride. And I read that book and I thought, you know, having just been through this 2-year-long inventors program, I don't really buy that. I think Richard may have his own biases and his own filters that he's seeing the world through. And I thought, I really want to see if there's any real evidence that Hedy Lamarr drove this invention, and wouldn't that be surprising to everyone? And I started calling up scientists who knew a lot about frequency hopping and asking them, like, is this possible? Do you think it's possible this actress, who was at the time starring on stage with 3 of the most major male lead actors all at once, you know, could she possibly have come up with this fundamental invention at night when she came home from the stage set? What are the likelihood? And to a person, they said, no, it's not really possible. It's an urban myth. None of these scientists were women. None of these scientists were people of color. And so I was skeptical of the scientists. I thought, okay, you don't think it's possible. I think it's possible, having been through this 2-year thing with the inventors I've met. I'm going to go a little deeper. And I made a pitch to the Sloan Foundation, who, God bless them, wanted a woman to look into this and was willing to kind of burn a little money to let me spend some time actually going out in the world and seeing, is there any evidence that this actress has done this thing? And this brings me to my favorite part of the story, because this part is weird and I can't explain it. But I found Hedy Lamarr's evidence when I didn't know that it existed in the world, but I really thought it might. And so I imagined in bed at night that she had left behind a tape. And on that tape, she had told the full story of how she came up with this invention. And I imagined that that would create an amazing spine for a documentary. And at the same time, I just kept making the documentary with other people sort of weighing in and saying it was possible, but maybe she did, but maybe she didn't. But as I imagined this tape that I thought existed, it became more and more real in my head. And I began waking up with a pounding heart, feeling like I had to find it. It actually woke me up at night. And so I began making lists of everyone on the planet alive today who could have this tape. And it was really bizarre, because I felt slightly like a crazy person. I also thought I was talking to Hedy Lamarr in my dreams, so things were getting a little weird. But I was very convinced that this tape existed. I thought maybe it had been part of a lawsuit, because she'd gotten in a lawsuit about ecstasy, her biography. And she'd said, there are tapes. I told my story in these tapes. And if you listen to the tape, you'll see that they're lying. The book was written by a ghostwriter and he's lying about my life, because that's not what I said on the tapes. So I thought maybe I'd find those tapes. And then I found definitive evidence that those tapes had been destroyed. And at that point, it was a real punch to the gut that those had been destroyed. But I didn't want to give up, and I didn't want to waste the money Sloan had given me. And so I made this list of 72 people. I still remember it was 72 people alive on planet Earth today who could have possibly recorded Hedy Lamarr. Every journalist, print journalist, friend, neighbor, anyone she ever mentioned as a friend or somebody at contact, anyone who ever worked on anything regarding her invention, etc. I had a team of 4 of us. We split up the list and we went down it, and we called all of those people and we struck out completely. We went down it again. And the 3rd time down it, we realized we had the wrong information for this journalist, Fleming Meeks. And as soon as I emailed him with the right email address, he called me immediately. I picked up the phone and he goes, I've been waiting 25 years for you to call me. He goes, I have the tapes. I'm like, the tapes? I mean, how do you even know I'm looking for tapes? Right? That's in my head. I have imagined these tapes. I have the tapes. So I go running over there and I sit down with him, and the cameras are rolling because I don't want to miss a moment of this. And you see a little bit of Fleming showing me where the tapes are at the beginning of the film. And I say to him, please don't start talking about tapes, because I want the cameras to be ready and rolling when you do. Talk about anything else. Like, where is your favorite place on earth? And he says, Tribeca. And I said, oh, my aunt's favorite place on earth is Tribeca. She lived on Warren Street. And he goes, where on Warren? I said, 88 Warren. He said, is your Aunt Jean Hollibird? I said, yes. He said, she was in my wedding party. She was a bridesmaid. And it turns out this person that I was scouring heaven and earth to find was actually down at the Odeon restaurant having a drink with my Aunt Jean every Friday night. And if I'd just given up the fight and gone to have a Negroni with Aunt Jean, I would have found him. And the weirdest part hasn't even happened yet. The weirdest part is he gives me these tapes, which he's lost and found several times over his life because he's carried them from apartment to apartment. And he gives them to me, and I stick the first one in the tape player and I press play, and I hear Hedy Lamarr's voice for the first time. And she says, I think I'm going to be able to control people after my death. And I thought, you know what, Hedy, I think you are, because I mean, I probably am just the journalist who was closest in physical proximity to Fleming Meeks that she could find and engineer into this situation. I mean, what is the likelihood? So that was this incredible moment for me, because I felt like, okay, you know, you can actually do something this crazy and it can kind of work out. You can believe in your heart of hearts. If somebody had come up with this invention, they would have made a tape. They would have told somebody, and they would have left some evidence behind, and that there it was. But it wasn't, and Sasha, I think you might be interested in this, it wasn't as easy as all that. It wasn't like I then pressed play and she told me the whole story and everything was perfect and I made the spine of the film. It wasn't like that at all. It was like she had left behind a broken mosaic and there were pieces all over the floor. And that now the game began, and she had challenged me, put the pieces back together and create the portrait. And for me, this is always like what documentary filmmaking is like. You are lucky enough to find some pieces of something that people might be interested in, and now you have to find a way to put them back together into some sort of compelling portrait, and you have to reanimate that portrait. It doesn't do it itself. And in Hedy's case, let me explain what I mean. When I pressed play on that tape, two other things became apparent. One, this was a woman slightly out of her mind, because nothing she said began and finished in the same location. What do I mean by that? She would begin a sentence, come up with another thought, come up with a third thought, and then go back to that first sentence. She would refer to something, forget what it was, come back to it 20 minutes later. So that it was a scrambled sense. This is a scrambled mind. And the other problem was when I pressed play, the sound itself started to physically fall off the tape, which is something nobody ever told me. But after a certain amount of time, sound, if you play a cassette tape, can just physically fall off the tape. So if you ever do find a tape, a precious tape from 30, 40 years ago, do not press play on the tape recorder and just let it run. You will never hear it again. So as soon as I began to realize that the tapes were degrading the moment I pressed play, I took them to a production house in New York and asked them for help. What do you do when sound is literally falling off of a precious tape you have to hear? I didn't even know what was on the tape yet. I heard the words Clark Gable and I destroyed a sentence. It was heartbreaking. And they said, you have to bake them in an oven. So then they took our tapes and they put them in an actual oven. And the sound re-adhered through the heat to the tape itself. And then we had one path to take that sound and digest it digitally and start to have a digital file that we could work with. But every physical tape as it went through that process was destroyed. So all that was left over was that digital sound file. And of course it was terrible sound. You know, it was sound that had literally been through a fire and through a digitizing situation, and it was 30 years old, and it wasn't a good sound recording in the first place. It was just supposed to be for somebody's notes. So that piece of broken, rambling, slightly chaotic sound that needed to go through another 3 months of sweetening in order to make it audible is what Hedy left me. And I remember taking a transcript of all of that and printing it out. And it was something like 50 or 60 pages, and just putting it on the floor of the loft where I was working, which was Susan Sarandon's loft. That's what she gave us for the film. She gave us the space within which we could work. And it was this loft where her puppies would occasionally come and take the pieces of paper I printed and poop on them. But otherwise, it was an amazing space. And I remember laying out all of this recordings and cutting it into pieces, into sound bites that might start to work with each other. And that's what I mean by a mosaic that was broken, right? I had to figure out that here she's talking about Mondel, her first husband, and here she is too. And I can put those pieces back together and, oh my God, she just said something really profound and revolutionary about how she heard about this problem of frequency hopping back at the beginning of the Second World War from this weapons manufacturer first husband, Fritz Mondel, who was working for the Nazis. Oh my God. You know, so it was like this incredible problem-solving, forensic kind of journalism situation where every once in a while there would be a breakthrough. And you would take that sentence and I would put it up on a corkboard and I'd be like, there it is, I have a sentence. And so on, until we had sentences upon sentences. And it took me about 3 or 4 months before I really knew what she'd said. And then I had a different problem to solve. Because, okay, I felt like she was telling me she'd done this invention and that I could now prove it. But I needed to know why her mind was so scrambled in the first place. And could I really in good conscience tell people that somebody whose mind was that scrambled had made this fundamental invention? And so a second layer of investigation began. And this is where I think it's very useful to have been an investigative journalist before I became a documentary filmmaker, because I think you dive into these investigations a little bit more willingly, with a bit more gusto, because you like them. And I think it's good to like them. And in this case, I liked this mystery of how did her mind get so broken? And I went first to Richard Rhodes, who'd written Hedy's Folly. And I said, how did Hedy's mind get so broken at the end of her life? And he said, well, it wasn't drugs. She didn't do any drugs. And I said, well, I can't figure it out then. How did she get to this place where such a brilliant woman was speaking in these shredded sentences? And he said, you know, I think she was really kind of a terrible person, and that she had this, you know, she had this fake inflated sense of herself and she didn't really do the invention. And so this problem of how her mind got shredded became more and more intense for me as the kind of second chapter of building Bombshell. And I found Robert Osborne, her dear friend of that period and the host of TCM, Classic Movies. And he started to tell me that, you know what, she was on quite a lot of drugs. I don't care what anyone told you because I knew her really well. But there was a big meth addiction, I think. And that was the first ray of light where I was like, aha, a meth addiction. Okay, that would create this kind of mental break. And it means I'm meeting a Hedy Lamarr here at 48 years old, 50 years old, who is not the Hedy Lamarr at 30 who created this invention, or in her late 20s. And I need to now figure out how this break happened at like, what, 42, 40, 38, you know, how this break happened. And so I went to her children and I said, did you know about your mother? Did she have a meth addiction? And they said, no, meth, no. But she did get injected every week with vitamin B12 from her doctor. And he had a weird name like Dr. Feelgood. So I was like, okay, that sounds weird. But maybe she's a Hollywood actress. Maybe she got vitamin B12 shots, you know. So now I'm Googling things, Googling every day. I've got Google alerts going, you know, vitamin B12, Dr. Feelgood, who's this guy? Like, you know, I'm getting Kennedy's Dr. Feelgood, but I'm like, that can't be the guy. And then another amazing bolt of luck out of the sky comes down from heaven like manna. There was a pair of authors working on a book about Dr. Feelgood. And a little press release came out about them. So I called them up. And they said, oh, yeah, we just started this book. We are working on this book about Dr. Feelgood. I said, have you found Hedy Lamarr in your research at all? A little bit, yeah. I said, how do you know about her, you know, in relationship to Dr. Feelgood? They said, well, we found his patient rolls. And we'll send you a photo of them. You'll see her name is on them. And then as they started to do interviews with people who had worked with Dr. Feelgood on developing meth, because early on he thought meth was going to be the great American drug because it helps you work all night long, right? He thought it was going to be a miracle drug for people with terrible debilitating diseases, like children with crippling diseases that didn't let them out of their wheelchair. He thought this will allow them to walk again. So they were doing interviews with people who had developed meth with him. And her name started to come up. So they would send me photographs of their transcripts. And in these transcripts, not only was she a patient of his, but she was, of course, an inventing partner. So early on, it became apparent that Hedy Lamarr had been inventing with this guy, like she did later with George Antheil, or earlier rather, and later with other inventors that I discovered. She had been brainstorming with him about how this new drug might change the world, and she had invested huge amounts of money in his trials. So she was injecting herself, not as kind of just a movie star trying to stay young and find the elixir of youth, which is what I first imagined, but as an inventor experimenting on her own body. And suddenly it became clear to me that she had been doing this experiment since a very critical moment, right in that period I had been looking at, where I see this mental break from a very cogent, very brilliant woman to this shredded mind, which I discovered in her late 40s, early 50s. So I begin to realize I can date the break. I can date that psychological break, and I can give it a reason. And it's this meth experimentation she's doing on herself. And that gave me yet another gift, that insight, because I started to realize that inventive mind of hers, she was turning it on herself because she was willing to experiment on herself. And so I started to question, where else had she done that? And does anyone know where I'm going with this? Where else did she turn on herself with her inventive mind? It's with the plastic surgery, right? The other thing that really jumps out at you about the old footage of Hedy that I was starting to get from her children was that she looked like a lunar creature in a mask. And she had this plastic surgery that looked almost like it had melted. And it turned out that's exactly what had happened, because just as she was willing to experiment on herself with meth, she was willing to experiment on herself with plastic surgery. And she had experimented with a kind of plastic surgery that was so ahead of its time that if you sat in the sun with it, it would literally melt. And people didn't know that yet. So she had done that. It turns out she had experimented with plastic surgery nobody wanted to give her. She had convinced these doctors to do it, and it had melted. And so then from there was another kind of light into a tunnel of darkness to try and figure out how to relay to you, my audience, that this was an inventive thing for her. It wasn't just a thing that women do to try and keep their beauty and therefore this kind of power, but it was a way of inventing a way out of aging and this loss of power. And so I started talking to people who were plastic surgeons in Beverly Hills about Hedy Lamarr. And we found this plastic surgeon who said, oh yeah, Hedy Lamarr, she was a major force in plastic surgery in Beverly Hills. Like, she was known as somebody who was an inventor. Like, she invented where to put the scars, and she was always telling her plastic surgeon, you know, different ways of doing the plastic surgery that she thought would be more advanced. And so you can see how weird and unusual this investigative journey was. You know, and it was like seeing these little rays of light that would show me a little bit more of the mosaic coming together. And then I was able to go back to the movie and bring that element in. And bit by bit, the mosaic came together. And I began to move backwards in time from this very broken, shredded woman who had been doing these experiments with plastic surgery, who had had this psychotic break, who her children told me was abusive with them. And slowly I was able to kind of peel away the layers of time to discover the woman who had come up with the invention. And you have to realize nobody remembered her. Nobody alive was old enough to know Hedy Lamarr in her 20s. So there, it became an investigation into the past through the documents, through the letters, through any kind of shred of evidence that might still be floating around in the physical world, but it wasn't going to come to me from a human. And again, I had to just believe that there was this Hedy Lamarr that I could discover from before the psychotic break, who was brilliant enough to have done this. And she began to take focus through these letters that she had written back to her mother in Vienna. And through an amazing piece of luck, a cache of letters that we bought from a Hollywood auction site, blind, because we didn't know what was in them, but we thought might be interesting for this reason. And in the letters, she had written about trying to track the invention through time and dating this man who was involved in bringing her invention into the Cuban Missile Crisis. So backwards and backwards I went in time with Hedy until I had this very clear idea of the woman she'd been before all the meth experimentation, before the plastic surgery experimentation, when she was young. And then I went back to the tapes and I listened to her talk about her childhood in Vienna and her father and all of that and his inventiveness. And that's when I began to reconstruct her as a child and how that inventiveness had been born into her. She had been part of this world in Vienna, which was the world of gentlemen inventors, the Jules Verne kind of world where you could be educated enough, even in your local gymnasium by the age of 15, to feel like you could bring what you knew about the physical world to bear enough to invent something completely new. And that impulse had been cultivated by her father, who, you know, took apart that music box, who took apart everything in her room with her. I found records that she had smashed light bulbs as a child to see how they worked. How did the inside of them work? And there was that inventive creative spirit right back there as a child. So it was all figured out backwards. And finally, you know, toward the end of the process, I started to feel like I knew that young Hedy, and I loved her. So I had gone from a woman who I really didn't understand, and in some ways I couldn't forgive. She abused her children, and she was a little bit psychotic, to a woman I really could love and understand as a child. And then the process was lay the tapes out and figure out how to tell that story and help you also bond with this woman and listen to this woman and how to reconstruct that story in her voice. And that's when Bombshell really started to take form. So I've talked long enough. I think it'd be great now to open up to questions. Does anyone have a question? David. David, I think you're muted still. Do you want to unmute, David?
Is it an irony and a metaphor that this kind of mind that became fragmented, as you say, came up with an idea about fragmentation, really? I mean, frequency hopping it's like this now connects with this. I mean, that's what made it such a great invention, that you had to jump around with it. They had to do putting her story together. I think that's fascinating.
100%, David, and what a great insight. In fact, when I first started to lay out her fragmented thoughts, I thought I'm frequency hopping through her brain.
Exactly.
From strand to strand. How bizarre. And I was. And I thought a greater filmmaker than I would have been able to tell the story that way, in these little fragments that you would have had to put together into a story. But I don't have that power. And it was hard enough for me to go back and figure out what had really happened.
Your audience is thankful that you put it together. I mean, it may be modern filmmaking, but it would have been quite a burden. At some point, I'd like to hear a little bit about Paris Hilton too, because that's a less monumental figure, but certainly something that's caught attention. And I enjoyed the way you're documenting it. May have had some effect on, indeed, her social conscious behavior. Although you say you'll wait and see how long it lasts. But I thought that was fascinating.
She was, in so many ways, the sequel for me to this film. And if any of you have seen Bombshell and are curious about whether something like that could happen to a woman today, could she be so misunderstood? Could she be so misinterpreted because of the scandals of her youth? That Paris is my attempt to answer that. And I think Paris, by doing, by appearing in this sex tape at the age she did, ended up with the same fate as Hedy in Ecstasy, where people just decided for the rest of her life, well, I'm not going to take her that seriously. And Paris played into that for sure, but it turned out that she had this deep trauma as a child that had caused her to create the Paris Hilton mask and the Paris Hilton persona. And again, it was this process of lifting the layers and going back in time and figuring out how that had happened and where the breakage was. And in her case, we got to do it together. It was a living person. It was a wonderful thing for me after Hedy Lamarr to have the living person to actually talk to, and not just in my dreams. And that's what you see in Paris. I think you see me trying to do that in real time with a person who's trying to figure it out herself. It's kind of a mystery. How did she get broken this way? And I think we do discover it. And we realize that it's something she can address, because she happens to have been kind of psychologically broken in this school where she was put into complete isolation. And she bands together with these other children that were abused in the same way, and they start to form a movement. And what David is talking about is that movement has taken off, and they've changed local legislation. Now they're changing federal legislation. And Paris says her nightmares have stopped, and she now has become an activist. So there's been a transformation with Paris, and there's been a healing. I don't know how long it lasts. I don't know, I certainly can't comment on that. But in many ways, I was able to do for Paris what I kind of wish I could have done for Hedy. Really address the great wrongs and see if there was a way forward.
Was it just a happy accident that her fellow alums got in touch with her while you were in the process of making this, or did you have something to do with bringing them together and bringing her into the fold?
I found out that Paris had been reaching out to people for 2 years, prior to us filming. And she would get in touch with one person, then she would freak out and she would stop the communication because it was too much. And so I started reaching out to the people she had looked up herself, because I felt, as a journalist, that feels okay to me. I didn't want to create a situation she wasn't already reaching out and creating, but I wanted to talk to the people she'd reached out to. So I would talk to them and say, what conversation, I had a truncated conversation with Paris about this or that. And they began to connect the dots between them behind the scenes, that they were all from that year that she'd gone to the school. And then I said to Paris, you know, this person, Katie, who you were reaching out to before, would like to talk to you again. So that's the only role I really had. She went back to Katie, Katie connected her to everybody else, and off they went.
Journalists can be more than just observers, but still be true to their calling.
Yeah, that was the attempt there. And you know, David, how difficult that choice is, because you don't want to walk in and change history. Then you have to document yourself because you're a change agent. And in this sense, I felt like I was a little bit walking that line, but it felt fair because she had already made the phone calls and the connections.
And I gather from your mom, if I may report, that she sort of paid a compliment to you at Tribeca, saying that you were not merely somebody there taking film of it happening, but that you really were a factor in this evolution.
Well, I think, and that is true, and thanks, Mom, for that sweet thing that you said to David. It is true that Paris said that, and I think what happened in the course of that film is that because I was so prepped by Hedy and what I'd been through with her, what I entered into with Paris was a kind of a therapy film, which I don't think I knew I was doing. I didn't think I knew that this was going to become kind of a genre, but it seems to have become a genre recently, and we were one of the first films where you actually do kind of go into a psychological trauma and try and help somebody with it in a way, you know, in the way that you can as a journalist. So that therapy, I think she couldn't do with a real therapist because she had been actually abused by a therapist as a child. And so I stepped into that void, and the documentary did. And as a result of that, I think there was some healing.
This isn't a question, but well, it could be a question. There's a part in the movie Bombshell, and I really like it, where they're talking about disputing whether or not she came up with the invention. And she sort of says, oh, I know what I did. You know, as if, and that to me is actually my favorite part of the whole movie, because it sounds to me that she knew her worth.
Yeah.
She knew her value. And I just thought that was very interesting. And did you get that sense from what you gathered, that she did not need other people to really, you know, weigh in on what she knew to be the truth of her mind?
100%. It's the part of her I like the most, that she didn't really care. I mean, she definitely did. For sure she did. And she ended up, I think, destroying her face and her body in this attempt at preserving her youth, because she felt that the world was telling her that that was all that there was of value of her, this beautiful young person. But deep down in her, when she was questioned about the invention and whether she did it, she acted like, you know, she had this deep conviction, and she didn't need the person asking the question, in this case, Fleming Meeks, to believe her in order to feel that it was true. It was just that sentence she tossed off. I know what I did.
I loved it. I just loved it. That was
she knew what she did. And she'd spent all her life being told it wasn't important, or it wasn't true, or, you know, go and sell kisses. And she had preserved that. I know what I did. And I think that poem that she reads at the end to Anthony on his answer phone before she dies, that poem, Do It Anyway, to me is connected with I know what I did. Because she's saying, I know what I did. Nobody recognized it. That was like getting kicked in the teeth. But she's saying to everybody going forward, do it anyway. Do whatever your contribution is to the earth and to the world anyway, even though you too might be kicked in the teeth, ignored, be invisible, and it might be excruciatingly painful. But if you do it anyway, you will find, and I think Hedy's telling us she found, at the end of your life, that this is the thing that mattered. And that in the doing, in the giving, that thing to the universe, to the world, in the giving, you find your meaning. And you don't need the world to applaud. And that is the sentiment that I tried to leave people with that poem, but it also was what I took away from spending those 2 years with Hedy. She really taught me that. Just do it and don't wait for the applause or don't expect it. You most likely won't get it. The world isn't like that. But in the doing, you can give something to the world that might actually be of value, and how many people can say that? So that will be what you will hold on to at the end of your life.
Thank you. I don't know if there's any other.
Yeah, this is Charles Richter. I'd like to ask a question about the business side
Yeah.
of documentaries
Yes.
and the impact of all the streaming services. So have the streaming services made it easier to make documentaries? How are they financed? What's the business side of making documentaries?
That's a really interesting question, Charles. It's changed an enormous amount since I began Reframe Pictures and since I made Bombshell. A little production company like ours can't really compete anymore in this landscape because the streamers have chosen 4 or 5 big production companies each to work with. And those production companies have become like big studios of the past. And they can do everything for lower cost because they're making so many things at once. Their overheads are lower. And so they have become like the gatekeepers. So the reason I did Paris for IPC instead of for Reframed is because IPC is one of these big 5 that can work with Netflix, that can work with Hulu, that can work with Prime, that have the relationships with all of those streamers. And they now are competing for directors. And they need to connect directors with projects before they get greenlit. So they come to you as a director, but trying to keep your little production company going has become harder and harder. That's the result. But on the other hand, there's a lot more money for documentaries, and there is a real appetite from all of these streamers, and they're competing with each other. So there's more projects available.
So do you have someone in mind for
for my next project? I'm in the middle of making this 10 hours for my next project, which is probably me done in this conversation about women in power and beauty and scandal. It's, again, all of those themes. It's 10 whole bloody hours. If you want to know the end of that conversation, please tune into A&E this fall. I will be all over it. And then I really want to turn my attention to something completely different. And that thing is love. I really feel like the next wave, we're going to be very interested in this. And I think the reason is that we have been, we've been spending the last 5 years in a space of anger and accountability, a reckoning, around, for me, around gender, around Me Too and everything that came with it. And I feel like I'm now on the other side of that conversation for me personally, where I've said my piece. And I would like to talk about the fact that there is a way forward from here. And we as men and women, we need to work together, and we need to create a new world where we're equals, hopefully. And so how do you tell that story? And I think it's in the love stories that need to be revamped, because I haven't watched a love story recently where I've really seen that those two equals fighting for each other, battling for each other, working to help each other. But I've seen it in real life in these extraordinary ways. I've seen men and women working together in ways that I don't think we've ever done in previous generations, and supporting each other and making breakthroughs for each other and being real allies to each other. And so bringing that to a love story, whether it's in reality or in scripted, I don't know, but I feel a great need to add my voice to that. Like, we can do it right. Relationships between men and women can be, transcendent. We can propel each other to the next level if we treat each other really with respect, and if we can treat each other as equals. What can't we achieve? So I want to celebrate that.
That's good. Are there any other questions? No?
Yeah,
Say, this was fantastic.
thank you. It was such a pleasure
So
to
much.
talk to all of you.
The backstory, loving Bombshell. I love the backstory. That was, someone wrote, I think it was Sasha, that it gave her chills, and it was sort of like you were meant to write that story or direct that story, you know, for sure.
It did feel like it came to me. Actually, every one of my stories, it has felt that way. I've had this weird sensation of somebody tapping me on the shoulder and saying, would you please tell this story? So I've been lucky that way.
Well, thank you so much for coming, taking time. I know you are really very busy, and thank you so much for everyone for coming. David, thank you so much for the idea and for getting us in touch with her. And we're going to be following you to see.
Thank you. Thanks, Yvette. Thank you, David. Thank you all for coming,
Thanks, everyone.
participating. Have a great night.